Hello, everybody. This is John Fenn, supernaturalhousechurch.org or CWOWI.org. We'll get you to our website. You can sign up for my weekly thoughts, a weekly email that I send out on Friday mornings, and a whole lot of other materials there. But today, again, is a step towards discipleship. You saw by the title, A Child Shall Lead Them. My apologies to the book of Isaiah that talks about the time to come when the wolf and the adder and all that will be at peace, and a child will lead these animals. But this example has to do with my son, and he's almost 39 years old at the time that I'm recording this. You might think that's strange for a little child, but my son, some of you know, and not everybody knows, so I'll tell the story a little bit, is our firstborn son, and he was born with the umbilical cord around his neck in a slip knot, and so resulted in an emergency C-section. And that lack of oxygen to the brain damaged his brain, and the condition for any brain injury during labor or delivery is called cerebral palsy. Not a disease, it's an injury. And so mentally, our son Chris has been studied and everything at around 4 years old, 5 years old. He takes in a lot more, but it gets jumbled in the brain or whatever. So mentally, he's about 4 or 5 years old, and he doesn't understand mathematics. Can't even comprehend the days of the week. I'll see you in 3 days. Okay, see you tomorrow. That sort of thing. But he's retained that sweet disposition. And yes, we've laid hands on him, and yes, we've prayed, and I fasted and everything else. Even had visitations with the Lord in our home, and even with Chris nearby. So you don't email me or message me about healing. Where Chris is in the matter, and I'm just filling you in for backstory here. Where Chris is in the matter is this. He's about 22 years old. He came crawling down the hallway because he's in a wheelchair. And he came crawling army style, pulling himself along. And he said, Dad, know what the Lord told me? What the Lord said to me? I said, no, what, Chris? He said, the Lord said he's going to walk through the mountains with me. Yep, that's what he said. All right, yahoo, isn't that great? He's going to walk in the mountains with me. Walk through the mountains with me. And he just thought that was great, and that's where he's been ever since. He talks about when he sees kids running on TV, he says, when I get to heaven, I'm going to run like that. And he says, when I get to heaven, no wheelchair. So that's where Chris is. And he knows the Lord, he loves the Lord, and for the first 24 years of his life, he was at home. But after his little brothers, graduated and went off to other school and college and such, and eventual marriage and everything, we realized that Barb and I could not handle Chris just by ourselves. It was a full-time job. And so it was either put a roof over our heads or care for our son. And so we made the hardest decision we've ever made in our lives, and placed him in a group home, which as of this recording will be 15 years ago in January. And so he wasn't doing real well at the group home, so within about 4 years, in an emergency situation, we found a home and we moved to be close to him, about 30 minutes away, because originally the group home was about 2 hours away. My lesson today and my sharing today is that Chris has said a lot of good things over the years. So many times he's used of the Lord. I've shared before, I think in this space, how one time I was having a bit of a pity party for myself. I had gotten Chris out of his bath, and he was on the toilet. He'd dried off, brushed his teeth. I was getting him dressed. And I was bending down. I was putting his socks on his feet. And during that time, I was having a pity party. I was saying, Lord, Father, how can I run a ministry and take care of Chris 2 days a week for his home visits on Friday nights and Saturdays, and just kind of feeling generally sorry for myself. And I finished, and just as I said within myself, I said, Father, what am I, a beast of burden? Just like that Chris, who again is seated on the toilet as I'm putting his socks on him while this is going on. Chris reaches out and pats me on the head and says, you're a good horse. and it just cracked me up, and I was like, okay, Father, I understand. Get rid of the pity party, get your attitude together. So Chris has been used many different times like that. He's got a lot of common sense. He thinks through things. One time we were talking about Santa Claus and everything, and yes, he knows about Santa Claus and such, but we were talking about just the theory of Santa Claus and everything. And I said, why do you suppose reindeer swim? Or why do you suppose reindeer fly? And he just looked at me and said, because they can't swim. That was his solution to Santa and the reindeer going all around the world. Why do reindeer fly? Because they can't swim. It was one of those blessings. So now I bring you fast forward to what happened on Thanksgiving weekend. This was a few Sundays ago as I'm recording this. And Thanksgiving weekend, Chris is at a group home, 4 men on one side, 4 women on the other, a common area, kitchen, etc., and 2 aides always on duty there. And one of the residents, who's a higher learning resident, higher functioning resident, I'll call him R. R had gone home for Thanksgiving, and this R is higher functioning. Sometimes he cooks stuff in the kitchen. He keeps the kitchen clean. He's in his mid-60s. Has had some heart problems, and he went home over Thanksgiving weekend. He came back Sunday, and what we learned is that he had asked his family if he could move down there to their home, or to a home next door to live among his family. From his standpoint, he's in his mid-60s. He's looking at towards the last part of his life, and he wants to be around family. Well, both times his family said no, that he couldn't live near them independently, and he couldn't live with them, and that he had to go back, which is by driving would be a 10 or 12 hour drive, and it was a flight that he gets back and forth when he goes for holidays. So R was very upset because his family had rejected him twice, saying that you can't live with us and can't live near us. You've got to go back to the group home. So when he came through the doors on that Sunday after Thanksgiving, already upset with his family, he went into his bedroom and he found someone had been in his bedroom during the long holiday weekend. And it turned out to be the fire department who had done an annual inspection. They look at each outlet, they look at every appliance and everything else, making sure everything's functioning right as part of the state inspection requirements and everything. So the fire department had been in there, but that didn't matter. R had, on that Sunday afternoon, just flew off the handle, just exploded, yelling at the staff and everything else, angry. People were in his room, and he was really angry with his family. And one of the things he wanted to do was take Chris's Kindle and probably destroy it in his anger. He was just looking for something to vent. So he starts to grab Chris's Kindle. Well, folks, you don't take Chris's Kindle. You don't do that. You don't take his Pepsi. You don't take his Kindle. So Chris held on to it and said, "Get away, R." And with that, R hit Chris with his fist twice. And of course it caused bruising, and the inside of his gums were even red and everything. But the aides were able to separate them very quickly. They were able to get Chris off the floor, back up into his wheelchair, get him calmed down because it was quite a couple of hits, and take care of the whole situation. And so when I got there later, as soon as I walked through the door, R kind of grabbed me, put a hand on my arm, and he looked me in the eye. I mean, he's just a foot away, eye to eye. And he says, "I'm so sorry for hitting Chris." He said, I like Chris, and I will be good to him. And I will be good to him. I'm being good to him right now. It won't happen again. Please forgive me. And of course I said, "I forgive you." And then he walked over to Chris, and he looked at Chris, and he bent over to him, as Chris is in his wheelchair. And he said, "Chris, I'm sorry I hit you. Please forgive me." And Chris looked at him very simply and put his arm around him and pulled him close. And all he said was, "I love you." And that was it. And in that moment, I was both proud of my son, but tremendously humbled that, having been physically attacked like that and being defenseless, Chris only has one good arm. He's not entirely defenseless. He can hold his own and take a swing himself, if he feels threatened. But that with his one good arm, sitting in that wheelchair after R had done that, and that Chris had that moment of decision and reached out and pulled R close and hugged him and just said simply, "I love you." That "I love you" took care of the injury. It took care of the sin. It took care of everything in Chris's heart. It was a little child providing an example. Everyone who was watching, all the staff members, we just stood in silence, and we were just humbled and amazed. And I learned such a lesson that day, that we do struggle with the emotions of the injustice of things that are done to us. And we may never get a person to say, "I'm sorry," like R did with Chris. But Chris was able to boil it down, to cut through the sin of the injury. And this R goes to church every Sunday. He's a believer as far as we know. As far as he would live his life generally, he just flew off the handle because of the injustice and the hurt that he'd felt from his family. But that fact, that just the simple "I love you" breaks through it all, cuts to the core, that we are to love people, that Jesus accepts us, and we can accept others in that forgiveness when they injure us. And so anyway, that was just a lesson learned. I've been thinking about it ever since, and it was a tremendous lesson learned. I just reflect on the basic childlike, simple faith of my son, who's 4 or 5 years old mentally, just be able to cut through the injury, cut through the hurt, cut through the physical damage, and just make that choice to say, I love you, to his attacker. And anyway, it was a blessing and a lesson for us, and I hope that's blessed you. I'll talk about something else next week. God bless. Bye-bye.